I'd like to welcome everybody who's here tonight to the Dali Museum for the return of our Dali and Science series. I know many of you have come through the fall, and we've done talks on Dali and ants, and Dali and paranoia, Dali and DNA, and I believe Dali and masturbation. So we've covered a wide gamut of topics related to Dali's work. This program is actually due to Debbie Cassill. We owe it all to her for suggesting the series. It's an opportunity for us to re-examine some of Dali's art in relation to scientific principles and thoughts. So Debbie, thank you so much. And tonight, we are very pleased to continue the series. So tonight we're going to be talking about Dali and eating, and focusing on eating and mastication and the whole dwelling and trying to consume. Surprisingly, when we think of Dali, we think of visual images, we think of dream images, we think of the visual sensations, but really, in putting all these images together, very clearly, Dali gives precedent to the oral sensations rather than the visual or the oral sensations. It's about eating, about tasting things. So tonight, we're going to have Dali's images will be subordinated to the taste and flavor of Dali. And so I'm going to look at Dali from several different directions, talk about some of his particular themes in relation to eating. We're going to look at some of his images of food, and we're also going to talk about his cookbook as a way of more or less concluding this. But this is a great image from the internet. It looks basically like your old TV dinner. I'm not sure how appetizing it is, but it's filled with things to put in your mouth. So here's a couple quotes by Dali related to cooking and eating. This one's very general. He just says, cooking is very close to painting. When you're making a dish, you add a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and it's very much like mixing paints. So he's very comfortable with this comparison between the world of cooking and gastronomy and the world of being a great painter and trying to develop images. A little bit further along, Dali says, I can only paint after certain delirious occurrences happen in my digestive system. So painting is nothing without the ravenous experience of having the digestive system torn inside out by great and wonderful opulent amounts of food. So there's a gastronomic principle behind his painting. And then here Dali says that the most philosophical organs that man possesses are his jaws. What indeed is more philosophic than the moment when you slowly suck the marrow of a bone that is being powerfully crushed in the final destructive embrace of your molars? For it's at the supreme moment of reaching the marrow of anything that you discover the very taste of truth. So that's certainly a little more of a statement than just painting is like cooking. I think at that point we are talking about really a philosophical system related to eating. And this, by the way, is from the Casanova suite, where this delectable little bird is about to be devoured by this man who's dripping saliva. And a very similar scene appears in 1930. This is an image from The Age of Gold by Dali and Buñuel, where the woman is so caught up in her erotic emotion that she winds up sucking the toe of a statue that's in the garden as a way of replacing, of course, desire. But it's very much like the crushing and sucking of the marrow from the bone that we're focusing on here. And then just a couple references, of course, to the sensory source of all of this, the lips. Dali, of course, made objects related to this. We have the luscious lip sofa based on Mae West. And we have the chompers of teeth of pearls and the ruby lips, which, of course, is a brooch that we have available and you can purchase tonight just before Valentine's Day out in our store. So perfect timing on that. Definitely encourage you to consider that. But, of course, not all of the way Dali approaches painting is about eating as being appropriate for society. This is one of the very memorable images from the early 30s. It's Freud's perverse polymorph, or a Bulgarian child eating a rat. And you can see it's basically a Gerber's baby in the act of doing something that we would consider to be completely upsetting and disturbing and socially unacceptable on every level. But he seems to be enjoying it immensely. Which brings us to our first topic, which of course is cannibalism. Yeah. With Dali, you have to start in the basics. One of the great Spanish images of the 18th century, and probably of all time, is Goya's image of Saturn devouring one of his children. It was during Goya's Black period that he painted this. It's considered probably to be the most upsetting and disturbing of all the black images that he created. And it's the one that seems to be the most emotionally horrifying on some very, very basic level. It's essentially a father devouring his son. And we can see the son has not stood up very well. He's not been able to protect himself, missing his head, his arm, and part of his other arm. And Saturn seems completely incapable of stopping. There's a gluttonous desire that seems to be driving him. And this image, I think, took a great hold in Dali's work because, of course, cannibalism is one of the key themes of Dali in the early 1930s. And here's a much later image. This is actually a detail, but it gives you that sense of the dog-eat-dog world that Dali is fascinated by, the idea that everything consumes everything. This is a detail from Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate, where you see actually a pomegranate just off to the side on the bottom left, out of which a fish is emerging, which is eating the lion, which is eating the next lion, which is then leading to the gun, and Gala is actually on the ground. But there's a sense that these are exploding out of each other, but they also could be going backwards and be consuming one another. And it's very unclear the way Dali has presented it. So there's an interview with Dali from Conversations. I believe these were done in the 1950s. Dali was asked, "Would you like to eat human flesh?" Dali says, "Morally, yes, because this is the most tender of feelings. Cannibalism has even become holy. After all, Catholics eat the Lord in the form of the Eucharist host." I think as Catholics, we probably would see a little bit of a difference between this and eating human flesh. But in theory, that's what the sacrament is all about, the transformation. So Dali is just being morally forward in this. One of the most graphic images that Dali created is one that has to do with cannibalism. It's called Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War. This was done in 1936, just prior to Spain falling into civil war. And it's one of the most ghastly and memorable of Dali's images. Basically, this monstrous creature that seems to be basically tearing itself apart. And we can see the head on top. You can see parts of the limbs have already been eaten away. There's pieces of raw meat lying around on the ground. Everything about it is completely horrifying. And the idea is that this is the personification of Spain, as Spain cataclysmically moves into the moment of civil war. And there's a quote that Dali has, and there's images that appear over and over again in Dali's work, which are beans. Beans are perhaps the most lowly form of food, perhaps next to rice. We look at beans, they're not very inspiring, they don't cause one to have a great appetite develop. Dali says one could not imagine swallowing all the unconscious meat within the painting without the presence of some mealy and melancholy vegetable. So for him, beans are required in order to get through this crisis of the soul that Spain's undergoing in the 1930s. But a very, very powerful image. Now, an image that's related to that, but surprisingly done in quite a different way, is this one. This is called Autumn Cannibalism. And this is a painting that's in the Tate Gallery in London. What's really different about it, it's painted at exactly the same time, deals with the same issue, cannibalism, something eating itself away. But here, instead of one creature, we have two people, a couple. And what's so disturbing about this image is not the horrific nature of the bestiality that we saw in the first image, but rather the sort of pleasantries, the sense of decorum that seems to be exercised in the process of slowly slicing and dicing each other's flesh away. So you can see that the gentleman is spooning into her, she's slicing into him. They seem to be caught in this mutual cannibalistic experience, and yet everything's presented as if this is just proper etiquette. So on that level, this is perhaps even more disturbing than the one we just saw. And then a classic from our collection, of course, everybody's favorite, the Archaeological Reminiscence of Millet's Angelus, where Dali focused on a particular painting by Jean-Francois Millet and reimagined it as if the female, very much like a praying mantis, after mating with the male, would then devour him and cannibalize him. So there's this femme fatale factor that Dali has brought into a very familiar painting, and he's focusing on just this practice that if you have praying mantises in captivity, the female will devour the male after they mate. So very disturbing. The surrealists were all very excited by this. They felt that it was the natural process, that females were just being a little more presented more clearly, perhaps, in the insect world. But but they would actually collect them and gather to watch this happen at parties. So something to think about for your next party. It'll liven it up immensely. Now here we move to a more specific aspect of cannibalism. Dali, of course, had a very deep falling out with his father. They had a terrible fight in Christmas of 1929. By 1930, they didn't speak to each other for 5 years. During this time, Dali turns his father into a kind of cannibalistic creature. So this is the first, one of the first paintings related to this theme. It's called William Tell. And what Dali does is he takes the story of William Tell, which is basically about the archer looking to win the release of he and his son from debtor's prison by shooting an apple off his son's head. Dali turns that around and basically re-envisions William Tell as committing infanticide, that he wants to destroy the son and eliminate him. So it's basically the classical Oedipal struggle where the father wins. And that's what we see here as the father's about to castrate him with a pair of scissors he has poised in his hands. But when we come to eating, this is an image of a movie. It's a still from a movie that was shot by Louis Buñuel after Dali's father threw him out of the house. And Louis Buñuel, who was apparently still on speaking terms with Dali's father, was able to film him and his wife as he devoured this entire plate of sea urchins. And what we're seeing here is one of these sea urchins being cut open, and he just keeps scooping out the marrow of the sea urchin and just really living the good life. This is the finest food that Dali's father can imagine. So it doesn't require a whole lot of effort to understand, actually this slide, and then we'll come back to that. This is a photograph Dali had taken by his friend, Louis Buñuel, when he was thrown out of the house. What Dali did is he shaved off all of his hair. He stood in front of this small shack that is in Port Legat, and he put a sea urchin on his head. And the idea is that if the father actually shows up, he'll be more attracted to the sea urchin than the son. He'll start to eat the sea urchin, and the son will be able to escape instead of getting cannibalized. So quite imaginative as a way of dealing with real issues in your family. But this is one of the prints that relates to this. This is a print called, from the series, the La Chance de Maldoror. We have it up in our Huff Gallery right now. And it's an image of the father basically devouring the son's skin as the son is under this sewing machine. And there's a surrealist metaphor that goes along with this. The metaphor is, it's as beautiful as a chance encounter on a dissecting table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. And here the father has come to help along this process of the beauty by devouring the child. So that's what this is referring to. Dali wants to live, so you put your father's favorite food on top of your head, and maybe you'll be able to escape by distracting him, diverting his attention. And finally, we have this wonderful image that I used for the poster outside. Dali also relished sea urchins. And in a way, there's almost a question that comes up, well, is this Dali becoming the father at some point? And I'm just going to avoid answering or even dealing with that issue altogether and move right along to something else. So we have now moved through cannibalism into a very different realm of eating and dining. And that's the idea of dining as a social activity. And Dali has certainly provided a few opportunities to talk about that. The first is to point out that whenever Dali had his entourage gathered around him, whenever he would go to Barcelona, New York, Paris, he always made sure he had his entourage in tow, and they always went to really fine restaurants. Especially if they had somebody like the Morses to pay for it, they would go to the finest restaurants. But Dali always wanted to be seen, and he always wanted to be seen with the entourage. So dining was a very important part of the social practice, which was the way that Dali placed himself into a kind of public forum. We also have upstairs an image that contains two gentlemen toasting each other over a bottle of Coca-Cola. So there's a sense that even in this double image of New Amsterdam, which is in the Huff Galleries, Dali has found within this Indian space the image of two Dutch merchants. I don't know if you can see their faces here. These are their hats, their collars, their red shirts. Both of them are toasting each other with a glass, and there's a bottle of Coca-Cola right here on the nose. So if you haven't seen it, definitely go up after the talk and take a look. It's a wonderful and strange image, but it's the idea, the context is social dining, that there's something here going on, that this is a very traditional way of celebrating. When in the 1940s, when Dali was here exiled in the United States, he organized in Pebble Beach, California, a writer's ball. And the idea was that there was a lot of people from Europe who were basically displaced because of the war. And so Dali wanted to help to provide some relief effort through finances. So everybody was invited to the party. There's actually some clips on YouTube that show let's see, who was it? James Cagney, I believe, and Bob Hope, frolicking in the activities. But it was a pretty crazy party. Gala, of course, dressed as a unicorn. She sat in a bed presiding over the dinner, and here she is being served her food in the bed. You can see that Dali has dressed somewhat anatomically, which I'm sure has something to do with being able to see Dali as he digests the food that they're about to eat. And they were actually served things like there was a tureen that they would open, and there'd be a live frog inside of it, large bullfrog. All the guests received one. So it was great fun, great strangeness, and a very memorable party, but all focusing around eating. And of course, one of the greatest, celebrated paintings by Dali is all about eating. It's The Last Supper that's up in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., where, of course, Christ, Jesus, suggests that somebody will betray him, but it's inevitable for this has to happen. So this is really Dali reacting to Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, but the idea is the context here has been stripped down to just the glass of wine and the bread that's been broken and placed in the center. So everything about this has become symbolic rather than realistic, which was what Leonardo da Vinci was focusing on. But we'll see that bread becomes a very central element in Dali's paintings about food. So before we get there, though, I just want to mention a few details about architecture, which Dali also perceived from a kind of gastronomic point of view. There was an article that Dali wrote in 1934. It was called "The Terrifying and Edible Beauty of Art Nouveau Architecture." And in the article, Dali basically spoofs André Breton's pronouncement. Breton was the leader of the Surrealist group, and one of the ways he would describe beauty, he would say, Surrealism has to be convulsive, or it will not be at all. That Surrealism has to be about this momentary experience that is so overwhelming that you can't control it. Dali takes that idea and he turns it into a new metaphor. He says the new Surrealist image of the cannibalism of objects equally justifies the following conclusion. Beauty will be edible, or it will not be at all. So for him, he's now coming forward with this idea that eating and gastronomy and the whole process of taking food into the mouth has an aesthetic quality to it, and it's a surreal aesthetic. And the building that Dali describes as the most edible is on Antonio Gaudi's La Pedrera, called Casa Mila, which is in Barcelona, right on the main thoroughfare. If you have not seen it, it's a remarkable building. It looks like a huge chunk of wedge cheese, like Swiss cheese. No right angle anywhere to be found in the building. For Dali, this was the epitome of edible architecture. So it's not a surprise that when Dali actually makes his own museum in 1974, he covers the wall, and you probably don't know this, but the wall itself, all these little dots that are decorating it are loaves of bread that Dali has cast into this particular style, and it's also, the turrets are all eggs. So eggs and bread are part of the building itself that Dali houses his artwork in. So again, edible architecture. That's a little Hansel and Gretel-ish, I guess. But now let's take a look at some of the various foods that Dali celebrates in his work and how he plays with this idea of food. There's a great quote that Dali has. He says, "I must be told a dish is excellent for my taste buds to palpitate." I'm not exactly sure what that means, that he has to be directed or told that something is good in order to recognize that it's worth being excited about. But the piece that we have here is from our collection. It's a wonderful example of how Dali creates double images and illusions. It basically shows you with three groups of figures, the three groups being vertical, how one image can transfer into looking very much like something completely different. But what Dali has done is he's created a still life where you have a tablecloth laid out with a kind of vegetable collection, or at least things you can put in your mouth and eat. And then behind it is an animal collection of people, and then a mineral collection of buildings and objects. So we have a glass, loaf of bread, some grapes, and then we have a man lying on his arm, a woman, and another woman who's standing and walking across. Then we have a tower, a mountain, and a wall. So it would be vegetable, animal, mineral, or vertical, prone, and lying down. So it's this really remarkable kind of still life. You're not aware of it until you start to see how it interacts. But again, food transforms into something quite different. Now, there's a great quote that Dali opens up his secret life with. He says, "I like to eat only things with well-defined shapes that the intelligence can grasp. I detest spinach because it's utterly amorphous character." So he completely and totally says, spinach, have no use for it. It's disgusting. He goes on to say, the very opposite of spinach is armor. That's why I like to eat so much, and especially small varieties, namely all shellfish. Which is interesting because, of course, shellfish do have a hard quality to it that protects it. But when you open a shellfish, what you're actually eating is something that's almost as gooey and amorphous as spinach. So there's this really clever thing that Dali has done, almost like a shell game, where he says, I don't like this, but I like that. But inevitably, it's the same thing. So he's I'm sure, very conscious about it when he does that. And then here's sort of the celebration of shellfish. Here we have a model from the Dream of Venus Pavilion, where shellfish have come to be delicacies for fashion. And Dali, of course, has the great quote about shellfish. He says, I don't understand why, when I ask for grilled lobster in a restaurant, I'm never served a cooked telephone. I don't know either, but it's a great quote. We don't know what to do with it, but it's wonderful. And then, of course, bread becomes a really important part of Dali's career from the beginning to the end. This point in his life, 1926, bread stands for basically sustenance, something, the most basic form of food that unites all people. And there's something about this, it's basically a still life that Dali created to prove that he could paint like the very, very best classical painters in Spain from any century. And it was also a get-out-of-jail-free card, because for Dali, the proof was in the pudding, so to speak. This painting was so perfect in his own eye that he felt that he had arrived as a great artist. He no longer needed to graduate, and he sabotaged his own graduation as a result. So he never received his degree, which allowed him to be sort of more like Picasso in his own mind. Of course, bread goes on to become something quite different. Here's one of our lovely paintings upstairs, the Catalan bread from 1932. Bread seems a little more unmentionable and a little more shocking in the way it's presented. Not quite sure what's going on here, but we do have a lasso and a rope and some ink to be smeared all over it. So bread has become more of a fetish by the 1930s. And then, of course, in the 1950s, bread becomes Eucharistic as Dali becomes converts to Catholicism. And here we have bread and fish in this still life. It's the evangelistic still life, where there's a sense of the story of the feeding of the multitudes. You have several loaves of bread, several fish. How will we ever feed so many people? And of course, the miracle happens. So these kinds of ideas are on Dali's mind by the 1950s, always focusing on food as a source to relay the story. This is many people's favorite photo by Halsman. It's the popcorn nude, where everything seems to be just exploding like popcorn, but of course, we have a whole lot of loaves of bread that are exploding at the same time, and this lovely lady who has become a jump figure for Halsman. But Dali is certainly putting his all into the pose that he's taken. And in 1958, Dali, of course, was responsible for overseeing the baking of a 12-meter loaf of bread. And here you can see the team of bakers that are coming out with this large loaf of bread to be presented, I believe, at the Paris Fair. And then, as I mentioned, Dali's building, decorated with loaves of bread and also with eggs. And here, of course, Dali at a bullfight, thank you, sporting the latest in fashion, which is, of course, a loaf of bread. But when we move to eggs, the eggs are a very important part of Dali's world. This is, again, another one of our works, Eggs on a Plate Without a Plate. Very central to the surreal experience. It's a paradox that he's presented. And there's two experiences that he's trying to relate to in regards to the eggs. The first is that at this point, Dali has become lovers with Gala, and she will eventually become his wife. And he wants to pay homage to her without painting her. So he says that the two eggs that look sunny side up, the lovely eggs on the plate, are actually an homage to Gala, to her eyes, which brings to mind St. Lucy, who was martyred by having her eyes scooped out and presented on the plate. Really horrific kind of martyrdom, but definitely related, I think, to Dali's very peculiar way of paying homage to Gala. And then, of course, Dali is born again because the third egg, the egg that's not on the plate, on one hand, is related to, or at least described as being the embryo with the umbilical cord holding it up. And the world that we're experiencing is Dali's memory of the intrauterine experience before he was born. And you just have to go with it. Yes, the intrauterine experience. The painting we have here from 1937, painted 1 year after the autumn cannibalism and the soft construction with boiled beans. This is a painting that also is in the Tate Gallery collection. It's called The Metamorphosis of Narcissus. And it basically deals with the myth of Narcissus who falls in love with his reflection. And then Dali has created an echo of that shape where they become two completely different forms that we're looking at in the exact same configuration. So on the left-hand side, we see Narcissus. He's looking at his reflection. This is his head. He's looking down. Two shoulders, his one knee, his second knee, and his arm, which goes into the water. And then on the right-hand side, we have a hand, exactly in the same shape, but it's holding an egg, and instead of a person or an animal being born out of it, it's a narcissus flower. So there's this very complicated way that Dali has developed these images, and this is the painting that Dali takes with him when he meets with Freud in 1938. So this painting for Dali is the most important work he had done during that period. And of course, the egg, which is the form of food, also is the form of reflecting the craziness of Dali himself. This is a self-portrait. Which brings us to the persistence of memory, a painting from a little bit earlier, and I'm sorry that this keeps going forward, but we have a painting here filled with soft objects. Watches are supposed to be hard in order for us to tell what time it is, in order to perform the duties of the day. If it becomes soft, everything's out of control and we have no idea what's going on. But Dali was inspired to create the soft structure by Camembert cheese. He said he was in his studio. It was a warm day. He had painted everything except for the watches, and he saw out of the corner of his eye that the Camembert that was sitting on the table had actually started to become very soft and runny. And so what we see here is the oozing Camembert in the one image, and then the result of the oozing Camembert as if it was a watch. So the source of inspiration for the most important image that Dali ever did was a lump of cheese. And I think that there's something fundamental to that, something very important. When we come to meat, here we have another image from the La Chance Tomadour suite. It's a self-serving bit of meat coming off this female creature who's slicing and dicing herself up and serving pork and different chops down here at the bottom. And then here's one of everybody's favorite quotes. Dali says, "I like gala and I like steak. Why would I not paint them together?" So we have gala and we have a chunk of steak over here on her shoulder. This is also an echoing of that, putting the sea urchin on top of his head. It's the idea that if Dali's father wants to destroy their relationship and he wants to go after Gala, perhaps he'll go after the chop that's on her shoulder, allowing her to escape during this time. So this is a constant theme in Dali's work. So now we make a jump to liqueurs, and this is Dali sporting the finest in liqueur aphrodisiac wear. This is the aphrodisiac dinner jacket, and Dali is wearing it. He's holding a stereoscope over here. Not sure if you can quite see that, but each of these glasses, according to Dali's plan for the aphrodisiac dinner jacket, it should have a little bit of creme de menthe and a dead fly inside of it. And the combination of those two should indicate the amount of arousal that the wearer has developed over time. So this is Dali's idea about how to deal with liqueurs. And then there's a great quote that Dali has about getting drunk. He says, about 30 years ago, I was at a grand dinner with the Spanish militia. I had drunk a bit throughout the day, and when they lifted the cover off the paella, the steam that escaped was so thick that I fell into a deep faint and came to be on the floor. When I told them that I had 5 martinis and some champagne, they concluded that I definitely passed out because of the drinks. Ever since that, I only drink mineral water. I don't know if this is true or not, but certainly Dali seemed to be a teetotaler. He would have parties at his house. They would always have champagne. He would rarely touch it. So it often seemed to be more social than something that Dali seemed to enjoy. But now, just before coming to the cookbook, I want to talk a little bit about utensils. This is our painting Suez, which rarely gets discussed on tours, but there's one really interesting detail. There's right across this, what appears to be like a hull of a ship, an empty ship, there's this long line, and it's actually a spoon that seems to have become like a serpent and taken on a life of its own. And it's as if by putting the spoon over here against the other side, it has aroused this side to also start to provide something for the spoon, which pulls away from the wall, almost like a little dollop of something to scoop up. So the spoon doesn't actually have to slice into the side will provide it for the spoon. Really strange. We'll just leave it at that. Very dreamlike, very much an image of the unconscious. But here's another one called the agnostic symbol, where something's being offered to us in the spoon, and the spoon is trying to get to us, but there's a little object here which it conveniently has found a way around as if it were a serpent of some sort. So very uncomfortable, unsettling images of very simple domestic objects and tools. And then here's this wonderful gilded set that Dali created in 1957 called the Mollusks shell cutlery set. And there's 7 pieces. It includes 2 spoons. Actually, I think there are 7 pieces. 2 knives, a 3rd spoon over here, and then the 2 forks. And I have a detail of the fork here. This is actually it's an elephant with the tusks, the ivory tusks are made into the fork. And this is, of course, a serpent with a forked tongue. So the fork is made of the forked tongue of the serpent. It's really one of the more wonderful things that Dali has created. He did the designs for it, and then some artisans created the objects, but really wonderful and strange. Which brings us finally to the cookbook, Les Dinners de Gala. And some of you, actually, does anybody here have a copy of this? Okay, so a couple of you do. It's a great book, and it was mass-produced at one time. It's now collectible, but you can still find it on eBay and other sources. It's really exquisite, it's extravagant, it's bizarre, and it's everything you expect from Dali in a cookbook. It was done in 1971. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a better photo, but you see Dali here basically at Maxim's in France with one of their chefs and perhaps the owner of Maxim's, I would assume. And this extravagant just buffet of exquisite strangeness is provided throughout this book. These are the items that Dali has described. He collaborated apparently with an unknown or a chef who wanted to remain anonymous, but a number of the recipes come right from Maxim's and some of the other great restaurants. And of course, Dali's secret life starts with the very quote, "At the age of 6, I wanted to be a cook." We always jump past that and we say, at the age of 7, I wanted to be Napoleon. My ambition's been growing ever since. Well, let's think about that. A cook is not such a bad thing. You know, in Dali's world, that's a great thing. At the age of 6, he went from cook to Napoleon. You know, so he went more specific. But I'm not sure in Dali's mind that he went much higher. I think he really appreciated what chefs do and contribute to the world. And he saw it with great enthusiasm, what they provide. So here's a quote. It just says, "All the recipes in the cookbook, never before published, have been elaborated with great precision by a chef wishing to remain anonymous. La Cire, Maxim's, Le Tour d'Argent, and Le Buffet de la Gare de Lyon have been graciously bestowed upon us with some highly gastronomical recipes which make for the renown of French cuisine." So this is surprisingly all about French cuisine. The book is just filled with these elaborate and exquisite recipes, but they're not Spanish, which is surprising to some of us. But they're things like sardines and boats, and of course Dali lovingly uses details from his own work to extravagantly make your mouth water with with just really inappropriate and rather horrific images. This is a really fun one. This is a bush of crayfish and Viking herbs. You can see this incredible, exquisite mound of crayfish that's been developed for us with, don't know if you can tell, but all these bits of herbery that are coming between them. And it's actually a very straightforward book. It gives you the items that you would need for the recipe, and then in order to realize this dish, it's necessary to have crayfish of 2 ounces each. Prepare the following ingredients for a broth: fumet, scented reduced bouillon of fish, consommé of white wine, vermouth, cognac, salt, pepper, sugar, and dill, aromatic herbs. Poach the crayfish in this broth for 20 minutes, let all cool for 24 hours, and arrange the crayfish into a dome. Strain the broth and serve in cups. Really simple recipes, but extravagant, over-the-top, kind of crazed inventions when you take a look at them. And the illustrations. I know that Deby has included a few of these in her presentation, so I only chose to include two. One of them, which unfortunately you really can't see very clearly here, but if you go upstairs, there's the whole suite of images that are used for illustrations in this book. This is one of a martyred saint who clearly has lost her arms. There's blood flowing out on either side. There's lobsters or crayfish that create this tower that leads up to her dress, I guess. There's what appear to be organs dancing all around in this kind of exquisite, like worm-like fashion. There's beheaded people all over the place. I assume this is the gentry of France who have been beheaded that contribute to this kind of beautiful luster of red that decorates the dish. And then there's this, this one that I can't look at it straight. This is a chicken and another chicken that's wrapped. But of course we have a reference to, is it St. Teresa's veil? To the idea of the apparition of the Lord that just happens to come through, I guess, in the stain from the chicken that's underneath here. But just very over the top and very crazy. Very appropriate for this set. And then the final three images I have deal with, of course, the process, the end of all of this. This is Dali again from that ball, where you can see a little more clearly the internal organs that he's featured on this anatomical costume. He says, my enlightenment is born and propagated through the guts. So again, everything comes back to this digestive process of being inspired by the world around him. This is one of the Halsman photos. Dali says that I personally indulge in atomic explosions. And this, I think, is very closely matched with his Alka-Seltzer commercial. I think Dali is very much thinking of that. And then lastly, the Kagane. Not sure if all of you are aware of it. I'm sure some of you are, but in Catalan culture, which is part of Dali's culture, every Christmas, the Kagane is actually brought into the manger scene, and it's placed behind the manger scene. This is done throughout the area in which Dali was born. Nothing is seen as unusual about it, and it's the idea that you're giving back to the earth what was taken from the earth. There's a cycle of process, and this is placed behind the manger scene. The one slide I thought I had, and when I looked at it when I got down here, it's gone. If you look online and you type in Kagane, you can actually find there's a photograph of one of the department stores in Barcelona, and they have a 3-story tall Kagane in the middle of, it's like in the middle of International Mall, this huge character. And I think it's really important to know this is the culture that Dali came from, and in a way this is part of eating too, is the giving back, so to speak. And with that, I would now like to invite Deby Cassill to come forward and talk a little bit about dining.
Man, that's a hard act to follow. So it has been my pleasure to do this series with Peter. I'm very grateful for it. And I'm from the University of St. Petersburg, right next door. And we are in the process of doing a sort of an innovative integration of the Dali Museum along with USF St. Petersburg. I'm very excited about that, because I put a lot of Dali in my lectures. So we're going to talk about tonight, in addition to what you covered, teeth, teats, and eggs. I was going to go to tits and ass, but we'll save that for another talk. Oh, that's not mine. Okay. I was going to say, wow, I don't know what to say about that. Okay. Not a problem. I brought mine on a stick. Oh, okay. So how many of you have eaten sea urchins? What are they like? Tell me, I've never had one. Green mush. Mussels. Okay. Salty? Slimy. Yuck. Not salty. Mild. Oh, okay. There we go. So we're going to begin with one of my favorite illusions from Dali, and we'll get into his illusionistic self when we get into Dali and his very twisted sense of fun. So we're going to start with the skull that he put together with real live women, and we're going to, I'll get this. Focus on the teeth initially. So I have to ask you, teeth, what are they good for? Give me 3 answers. Chewing, tearing, and enunciating and biting. I like that. I'd give you an extra credit point if you were my student. Biting, chewing, what else? Smiling. I'd give you an extra credit point too. Love this. I think it's one of his most exquisite symmetrical paintings. So not only in addition to chewing and smiling and tearing, they are displays of weaponry. Baboons actually are for the most part herbivores, plant eaters, and yet they have these very, very sharp, oops, I'm going to do the same thing as you did, back and forth, very sharp canines. And what they do is they tell, this is a male, a mature male, and he is signaling to other males in his troop that if they come inside his territory or near his many wives or children, he will engage in a battle. It is all about mano-mano alpha animal behavior. And they use the teeth because primates have lost their claws. All primates have fingernails, just like we do. So the teeth become that weapon of choice when they want to declare their king of the hill behavior. We have, even though we have lost our canines, we still have that urge and that impulse to snarl when, especially males, when we're feeling threatened. All primates do it. We gave a talk, actually we didn't, but in one of my classes I say the symbol among males is not so much the primates anymore, or the canines among humans, it's penile size. You men have the biggest penis of any of the primates. The gorillas, the size of my little finger. A fully grown gorilla. Ours, yours, not mine, much larger. And before we gained clothing, but we had lost our fur, this was the way that you indicated, I'm mature, I'm a male, and I've got enough testosterone to donate sperm to the females. We found the penises attractive for that reason because we wanted our sons to have them. And it's all about reproduction more than it is about eating. So who has teeth? Not just primates. In fact, the sea urchins that were in many of Dali's paintings, the Echinoderms. Right up here, they have 5 sets of teeth, and they will chew your heart out if you die under the ocean or drown to death and you're not eaten by the sharks. It is the small, innocuous-looking echinoderms that will literally tear into your flesh and eat you and recycle you, as we do with food. Also, the mollusks, the simple little clam and oyster cousins, the squid and octopuses, have these enormous claws or beaks, actually, that they use for digestion. Our near neighbors, the alligators, and also our near neighbors, the rattlesnakes, and also our new near neighbors, the pythons. Python, now, you'll notice that the teeth structure on the python is very different than the teeth structure on the rattlesnake. Anybody have any idea why that might be true? Yes. How? They push the food down. Very good. I saw a hand go up here. Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. They're forward, they're backward focusing. Well, it turns out that these guys, it's hollow, and they use it as an injection tool for their toxins. And it turns out that the toxins are very little different than our salivary glands. Our saliva breaks food down and turns it from a solid to a liquid, which is exactly what the snakes do, only theirs is much more highly concentrated. So they can do it much more quickly. And it also affects the nerves more quickly, so that when they bite the animal, it's still living and the heart's still beating, but they can't run. They've lost that ability. These guys also use their teeth, but not to inject toxins to kill us. They just have these teeth to hold on to us anywhere on our body. They don't have to swallow us right away, and then they wind themselves around us and they constrict us so that we suffocate, and then they swallow us whole. I would love to be a snake for one day and just take in a big chunk of beef, swallow the whole thing instead of having to have it butchered ahead of time. I just think, wow, what a gastronomic delight. And then sleep it off for the next 2 months while my body digests it. How cool is that? Dun, 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 dun. Sharks, major teeth. And unlike us, we are born with, or we have baby teeth, and then we have our adult teeth. We lose the adult teeth, we're SOL. These guys have new teeth forming all of the time. Pretty impressive. We have, who recognizes this fish? Yeah, and look at these teeth. They're very, very much like the shark teeth, in that, and their job is not to swallow the whole animal or catch it, but to tear chunks of the flesh off. Exactly what the sharks do. They don't swallow us whole. They just bite, whip around, cut us open, and tear us apart. Anybody know what this fish is, Mike? Not this one. Parrotfish. Very close, like a triggerfish. Who knows what it eats? Barnacles. You're exactly right. You are earning points right and left. I think you're up to 3 so far. So yeah, these are barnacle crushers. So they have teeth very much like our molars. These fish go after smaller fish, but not very small fish, and they're able to catch them and pierce the flesh and hold them till they die, and then they throw them in the water and swallow them. Who said the eel? This is a lamprey, similar to an eel. But not only do they have these teeth to hold on to and tear the flesh, they've got teeth in here as well that they use once they've got a hold of you. They hold on with these, and then they use these to gnaw into the flesh of the animal, and they'll suck the blood and the flesh. They're like little vampires. And then this fish, I absolutely have no idea what it is. Yes. A gar. What do they feed on? Very small fish? Point for you too. When you're old enough, you come to USF St. Petersburg and take my biology courses. I'll make sure you get a scholarship. I'm serious. Very good. Okay, so a gar, I had predicted, because their teeth were so small and their jaw was so big, that they went into schools of small fish and kind of flapped around until they just, by chance, were able to get some fish and then swallow them, but it had to be small. The next question is, who doesn't have teeth? Isn't this the cutest little picture you've ever seen? Birds, absolutely, have lost their teeth. They have beaks. So how the hell, when they get the hard seeds from your yard, Lucy, do they chew those seeds up? They have, who said gizzard? Yes, point. Gizzard, yeah. And what do they have in their gizzard to help chew it up? Stones, absolutely. Okay, points for you too. Yeah, they swallow rocks, which we've seen them on the side of the road taking little pebbles, and they use the stones to grind the seed once it's inside the gizzard. And that starts the digestive process. I just think this is so funny. Can you imagine these little beasts flying around and taking chunks of us? You know, flesh. It's one thing to be in the water with fish, like piranhas, but another one to have them flying through the air and taking pieces of flesh off of our bodies. Ugh, scary. Okay, so the second not only displays of weapons and for chewing and eating, but teeth are indicators for humans of our age. We are born without teeth. We'll get back to that. We have the first pair for the small kids, and then they fall out or are pulled and go to the tooth fairy. We get the adult teeth, and we get the lovely smile. They're also indicators of health and beauty and vigor. This is a happy dog. This is a happy albino gorilla, one of our cousins. And I love this one. We'll get to the horse's teeth in a minute, why it's shaped that way. But here you can tell, and I ask my students, we are so programmed by our genes to look for indicators of health that we're not even aware of it. But the things we look for, name me 3 things that you see here that are indicators of health. The eyes, the skin. And what about the skin, Hal? It's clear, there are no sores, there's no oozing things, it's not hanging, it's not injured, there's no scars from disease. Zits, oh yeah, been there, done that. The eyes are clear and nothing hanging down. The whites, which is a huge indicator of health. We're the only primate that has the white showing, and we think that's because it was selected for. And of course, the pretty teeth are not falling out. They're also indicators of disease. Yeah, use your toothbrush. They can be a fashion statement. I love the grill. Gold, mind you. I've got braces. I'm 65 years old, and I've got braces because I wanted them to be pretty. You know, everything else is fading away. I figured that's something I could fix. And this is interesting. Tattoos. Yeah, never. Finally, they're good for eating. And if you are an animal that eats vegetables, and I love this. This is Dali's vegetable painting with a bowl and some tubers and sea urchins, and you flip it upside down, and it's a man with a hat, the eyes, the nose, the cheeks, the smile. Here they are here. Here they are there. I love Dali. He's just amazing. And if you're an herbivore, you're going to have specialized teeth for the grinding and the biting off of the tough plant material. What's interesting about the cows, anybody been licked by a cow? Very rough tongue. Where? You're nodding. Did you say yes? Yeah, where? But where? What state? What state? Oh, in Tampa. How cool. What's interesting is they've lost their upper teeth. They just have a really hard palate that they bite against. The same with a sheep. It's got an extended growth of the bony palate, and they just have the bottom teeth here. Who knows what animal this is? Yeah, very good. They've retained the upper teeth as well as the lower teeth. And who knows what this animal is? Any idea? Elephant. Yeah. Yeah. The tusks are out here, but very much the molar, thick cusp for grinding. Very very thick, and these animals have the molars in the back as well. For animals who are meat eaters, and humans have been for probably 1 million years, we, the carnivores, have to have the sharp canines, not only for displays of their maleness and their willingness to defend their families, but for tearing into the flesh, for catching and tearing into the flesh. We have both. Our canines are not nearly as impressive as those of our primates and our cats and dogs. But we chew and have multiple points on our molars, and just we tear and eat flesh as well. We've needed to survive. The fruit. I love this painting. And I'm going to walk through some of Dali's works art that show. Oh, somebody had a question? Oh, okay. Show the fruit that we eat, the nose, cheeks, lips. Very, 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 makes my mouth water. Fish. And this is part of his cookbook. Okay. The bread. We need teeth to bite into the bread. And in fact, what's interesting, let me go back one. What's interesting about our evolution over time, the last maybe 200 or 300,000 years, that we went from eating fruit. That's why as our ancestors lost the canines. They weren't meat eaters. And then they transitioned to the water and ate fish, which is like the fruit of the sea. And it's something we could eat even today, a raw fish, pull the scales off with the teeth we have. We didn't go to meat eating until we had gained weapons to butcher the meat first and then eat it in small chunks. Bread's been around. Beer. One of my buddies is a great beer connoisseur, and we call it liquid bread. It's fermented in the same way. You need teeth to eat the fowl that Dali has here, decorated and tied up in some other interesting ways. And here's just a mosh pit of humans feeding on each other and for making new humans. Pheasant, come from a family who hunted pheasant up in the Midwest. Delicious. And back to this, you need teeth for crushing the shell, and then the lips and tongue for sucking the flesh out of that and licking it down deliciously. I love this. Pastries. Not only are we addicted to sugary treats, but Dali has painted the other kind of sugary treat that we tend to like to ingest in some form or another. This is the only painting where Dali had teeth really showing. And along with it, the oral care. I love this. So I'm going to use this as a teaching tool for why you don't want to not brush your teeth and why you want to go to a dentist all your life. So we're going to switch from teeth and move to the teeth. So if teeth are good for eating, why aren't infants born with teeth? I ask you. They suck the mother's milk. How many of you have nursed babies? I'm glad they didn't want to have teeth. It would have been painful. And that's exactly it. We are born and are on a liquid diet. All of us were on a liquid diet as infants, and so there is no need for teeth. So teeth have been moved out of us evolutionarily until we needed them. And the point about starting life, we're going to move from the teeth. We'll get back to the teeth in a minute, but go to the egg, because we all animals, with rare exception, start out as an egg. And an egg was a very prominent theme of Dali's, as we can see up here. We all grow starting on the egg, with the egg, on a liquid diet. for those of us who are mammals and where we parasitized our mother and developed from an egg to a fairly fashionable semi-midget human, it was all on a liquid diet. Thank you, that was meant to be funny. So Dali didn't celebrate the egg necessarily as a source of food, and I loved your explanation of the eyes and what was this? The embryo, yeah, or something. He celebrated the egg as the regeneration and rebirth of life. And it is exactly the long-term picture of life. Has to start with the birth of an egg, the growth of that egg, the development of that egg into something exquisitely different with a heart and a gut and teeth and a brain, whether it's human or some other animal. It is one of life's great events. Oops. So, after birth, we stay on. We all stayed on this liquid diet because of the exquisite mammary glands. And Dali was fascinated by the breast. Interesting study, I won't get into it tonight, but interesting fact is that we are the only mammal and the only primate who maintains the teats in a voluptuous, full form throughout our lifetime, whether we're nursing or pregnant or not. And there's a big question from an evolutionary perspective of why we primates have maintained this fleshy appendage beyond the nursing. And that's I'll discuss that afterwards or give another presentation sometime in the future. But the point is that all mammals nurse their infants on a liquid diet long before they grow and can get their own food. Oops. Cows and goats have goats have two teats like we do, but instead of being up in the pectoral region, they're down in the groin region. The cow, even one-ups us, has 4 nipples, 4 teats, 4 mammary glands, but this nice little catch-all udder, one little bag where all the mammary glands are piling the milk into, and then despite the fact that it has 1 or 2 cows at a time, it can nurse up to 4. How efficient is that? I'm envious, actually. Dogs and cats, many teats. They have litters. I don't know why we don't have litters. God forbid. I guess so. But it's pretty cool. And the sows have actually up to 12. So I think dogs have 8, cats have 8, and sows have up to 12, sometimes maybe even a little bit more hanging down there. So my question to you, are teats on a boar useless? What's your opinion? Yes or no? They seem to be. This is something I just learned last semester. Turns out, guys, if you have functional mammary glands, they're mostly turned off. But if you have an infant, like your wife dies or whatever, and that infant suckles on your nipples, or anything suckles on your nipples, within a couple of weeks you will be producing milk. Believe it or not, all males are capable of that. I see you all going, oh God, ick. There are some cultures, and not only that, not only you guys, we grandmothers who have lost, we think, our ability to lactate, not true. We can take a grandchild and within a week be lactating. And what's really cool is for those people with penises who like each other and want to live together, the gay community, totally acceptable and will eventually happen, not in this generation, but maybe a couple down the road, not only can adopt children, but one of the males or both can nurse them. I know. It's a biological fact that it's possible. So are they useless on a boar? Probably, but not so useless for us. How would Dali answer this question? I think he would say that the tits on a boar are as useful as lobsters on a vagina. And that we come to the end of our first talk of our spring series. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and enjoy your evening.